What happens when one of the most respected actresses in Hollywood decides she has had enough of a talk show host's arrogance? In just 18 seconds, Piers Morgan went from confident interviewer to completely speechless victim of the most brutal takedown ever witnessed on live television. This exclusive story reveals exactly what happened last night when Meryl Streep walked onto that stage and delivered a reality check that left Morgan scrambling for words and the entire studio audience in absolute shock. The tension was building from the very first moment Streep sat down in that red leather chair. Morgan had been riding high on his recent controversial interviews, thinking he could push any guest around with his signature aggressive style. But he was about to meet someone who would not be intimidated by his tactics. So Meryl? Morgan began with that smug smile he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. Let me ask you something that I think our viewers really want to know about. Streep sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with those sharp eyes that had captivated audiences for decades. She knew exactly what was coming. This was not her first time dealing with a host who thought they could rattle her. Your recent comments about young actors in Hollywood? Morgan continued, leaning forward like a predator moving in for the kill. Some people are saying you are out of touch, that you do not understand what it is like for actors starting out today. The camera caught every micro-expression on Streep's face. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply tilted her head slightly and waited for him to finish his attack. Morgan pressed on, clearly enjoying what he thought was his moment of dominance. When you were starting out, things were different. Easier, some might say. Do you think you have lost touch with reality? The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Morgan sat back in his chair, that arrogant grin spreading across his face as he waited for Streep to stumble over her words or get defensive like so many guests before her. But Streep did something that nobody expected. She smiled. Not a nervous smile or a fake television smile, but a genuine, almost amused smile that made Morgan's confidence start to crack just a little bit. Piers, she said in that calm, measured voice that had delivered some of the most powerful performances in cinema history, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. Morgan's eyebrows shot up. He was not used to guests taking control of the conversation so smoothly. Oh, really? He said, trying to regain his footing. And what misunderstanding would that be? Well, Streep replied, settling back in her chair like she owned the entire studio. You seem to think that asking me loaded questions based on things that other people supposedly said is actually journalism? The first crack appeared in Morgan's armor. His smile faltered for just a moment before he tried to recover. I am asking you direct questions about your public statements, he shot back, but there was already a defensive edge creeping into his voice. No, Streep said firmly. You are asking me to respond to anonymous criticism that you may or may not have heard from unnamed sources. That is not journalism, Piers. That is gossip. The camera captured the exact moment when Morgan realized he was no longer in control of this interview. His confident posture started to shift as Streep continued speaking with a kind of quiet authority that filled the entire room. But since you brought up the topic of being out of touch with reality, Streep said, and now there was steel in her voice, perhaps we should talk about that. Morgan tried to interrupt. Now wait just a minute. No, Streep said, raising one hand slightly. And somehow that small gesture was enough to stop him completely. You wanted to have this conversation, so let us have it. The studio audience was completely transfixed. They could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Morgan looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. You sit here every night? Streep began, her voice growing stronger with each word, interviewing people, asking them personal questions, challenging their life choices, questioning their integrity. But when was the last time anyone questioned yours? Morgan's face was starting to turn red. He opened his mouth to respond, but Streep was not finished. You talk about being in touch with reality? She continued. But your reality is sitting in this chair, in this studio, asking other people to justify their existence to you. Is that really the position you want to lecture anyone from? The control room must have been in complete chaos. This was not going according to any script or plan. Morgan was supposed to be the one asking the tough questions, not the one being put on trial. I think you are deflecting from the original question, Morgan said weakly, but everyone could hear that his confidence was completely gone. And I think you are deflecting from the fact that you have built a career out of making other people uncomfortable while never being held accountable for your own actions, Streep replied, without missing a beat. The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Morgan was visibly sweating now, his careful television persona crumbling in real time as one of Hollywood's most respected actresses dismantled his entire approach to interviewing. Look, Meryl, Morgan said, trying desperately to regain some control. I think we are getting off track here. Are we? Streep interrupted, and her tone was so sharp it could have cut glass. Because I think we are finally getting to the heart of the matter. Morgan had no idea what was coming next, but everyone watching could see that he was about to experience the most humiliating moment of his television career. Streep was just getting started, and she had 18 more seconds to completely destroy everything he thought he knew about conducting an interview. Section 2. You want to know what being out of touch with reality looks like, Piers? Streep asked, leaning forward slightly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience dealing with men who thought they could intimidate her. It looks like thinking you can invite someone onto your show, insult them with secondhand gossip, and expect them to just sit there and take it. Morgan was now completely silent, his mouth slightly open as he struggled to find any response. The confident television host who had started this interview was nowhere to be found. It looks like believing that your job as an interviewer is to tear people down instead of having genuine conversations, Streep continued, her words hitting like precision strikes. It looks like confusing aggression with intelligence. The studio audience was completely captivated. Some were leaning forward in their seats, others had their hands over their mouths in shock. They were witnessing television history in the making, and they knew it. Morgan finally managed to stammer out, I was just asking questions that our audience once answered. Streep's laugh was not cruel, but it was devastating in its complete lack of respect for his excuse. Your audience? She repeated. Piers, your audience deserves better than watching you use your platform to humiliate guests for entertainment. They deserve actual journalism, actual insight, actual conversations that matter. The camera operators were frantically adjusting their angles to catch every moment of Morgan's complete meltdown. His face had gone from red to pale, and beads of sweat were visible on his forehead under the studio lights. But most importantly, Streep said, and now her voice carried a finality that made everyone in the studio hold their breath, your audience deserves to see what happens when someone finally calls you out for turning interviews into personal attacks. Morgan tried one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Now see here, Meryl, I think you are being unfair. Unfair? Streep interrupted, and the single word carried so much power that it seemed to echo through the entire studio. Unfair is ambushing guests with anonymous criticism. Unfair is using your platform to make people defend themselves against attacks you cannot even properly source. Unfair is what you have been doing for years, and tonight it stops. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Morgan sat there, completely speechless, his carefully constructed television persona lying in ruins around him. He looked like a man who had just realized that all his tactics and tricks were useless against someone who simply refused to play his game. You know what the real tragedy is? Streep asked, but it was clearly not a question she expected him to answer. You actually had the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with someone who has spent decades in this industry. You could have asked about craft, about storytelling, about the real challenges facing actors today. Instead, you chose to try to tear me down with gossip. Morgan's hands were visibly shaking now as he reached for his water glass. The confident interviewer who had started the show was completely gone, replaced by a man who looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. And the saddest part, Streep continued, her voice growing softer but somehow even more devastating, is that this is what you think good television looks like. This is what you think your audience wants to see. The camera caught a close-up of Morgan's face at that moment, and viewers could see the exact instant when he realized that everything he thought he knew about conducting interviews had just been completely dismantled by one of the most respected actresses in the world. I think, Morgan said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper, we should probably move on? Streep said, raising an eyebrow. Piers, we are not moving on. We are having the conversation you started. You wanted to question whether I am out of touch with reality. Well, here is some reality for you. She paused for a moment, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable level before delivering her final blow. The reality is that respect is earned, not demanded. The reality is that intelligence is demonstrated through thoughtful questions, not aggressive attacks. And the reality is that after tonight, everyone who watches this show will know exactly what kind of interviewer you really are. Morgan looked like he had been physically struck. His mouth moved, but no words came out. The man who had built his career on never being at a loss for words was completely and utterly speechless. Now, Streep said, settling back in her chair with the calm confidence of someone who had just delivered the performance of a lifetime, did you have any actual questions about my work? Or are we finished here? The studio audience erupted into spontaneous applause, something that never happened during the middle of Morgan's interviews. The sound filled the entire studio as Morgan sat there, defeated and humiliated, realizing that he had just been completely outclassed by a guest who had refused to be intimidated. For the first time in his television career, Piers Morgan had absolutely nothing to say. The man who had made his reputation by never backing down from a fight had just been demolished by an actress who had simply refused to play by his rules. The cameras captured every second of his complete and total defeat, and everyone watching knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Meryl Streep had not just won this confrontation, she had completely redefined what it meant to stand up to a bully on live television.